She said
I would
yes to
love
the
to marry
ring,
you.
and 11 months later, 600 guests watched her stand alone at the altar in a $40,000 dress, holding a bouquet of white peonies, while the groom's cell phone buzzed in his best man's pocket with a text from another woman that said, "I'm pregnant, and it's yours." Before we get into this story, please hit the subscribe button and like our video. It helps the channel grow, and drop a comment below. Let me know if you're watching from the United States, Canada, the United Kingdom, or anywhere else in the world. Let us know how far our video has traveled to reach you, because what you're about to hear is a story of betrayal so cold, so calculated, that it will make you question how well anyone can really know the person they love. Now let's get into this. Her name was Harper Doyle, and in the spring of 2010, she was 24 years old, working the front desk of a mid-sized accounting firm in Columbus, Ohio, wearing thrift store blazers and eating peanut butter sandwiches at her desk because rent alone took half her paycheck. She had grown up in a small house outside Dayton, raised by a single mother who cleaned office buildings at night, and Harper had promised herself two things as a little girl: that she would never depend on a man for her survival, and that she would build something of her own someday, even if she didn't yet know what that something was. She met Beckett Lawson on a Tuesday in October, at a coffee shop 3 blocks from her office, when he spilled his espresso reaching for a napkin, and it splashed across the hem of her only good skirt. He was mortified. He insisted on paying for dry cleaning, then insisted on buying her a new skirt entirely, then insisted on taking her to dinner to apologize properly, and Harper laughed the whole time because she could see exactly what he was doing and let him do it anyway. Beckett was 28 then, the son of a real estate developer who had built half the shopping centers in central Ohio, and he was already carving his own name into the family business, flipping properties with an instinct that made grown investors nervous. He was charming in the specific way that money makes charm feel effortless. He remembered small details. He showed up early. He called when he said he would call. For the first 2 years, it was the kind of love people write songs about. He took her to see the ocean for the first time on her 26th birthday, and she cried on the beach in Charleston because she had never seen anything so big and so blue in her whole life. He learned to make her mother's chicken and dumplings recipe just to surprise her on a Sunday. He told her more than once, lying in the dark with her head on his chest, that she was the only person who had ever made him feel like more than his last name. But somewhere around year 3, small things started to shift, the way a house settles before anyone notices the cracks in the drywall. He started working later. He started taking calls in another room. He started flying to Chicago and Miami for investor meetings that Harper was never invited to, not even for the ones on weekends. She noticed, but she told herself what women in love often tell themselves, that busy men build empires, and empires take sacrifice, and her sacrifice was patience. The first time she caught him, it was March of 2015. She was picking up his dry cleaning as a favor, and a receipt fell out of his jacket pocket for a hotel room in downtown Cleveland, a room he'd booked for a night he told her he was in Detroit. When she confronted him, he didn't deny it right away. He sat very still, the way people do when they're deciding how much of the truth to give you, and then he told her it was a woman named Priya from one of his investment groups, that it meant nothing, that he'd been stressed and stupid and it would never happen again. He cried. Harper had never seen him cry before, and something about the sight of it, this powerful, controlled man falling apart in front of her, made her believe that the tears themselves were proof of how much he loved her. She forgave him in 11 days. The second time was harder to excuse. In the fall of 2017, a woman named Destiny Marsh, a bartender from a rooftop lounge Beckett frequented with clients, sent Harper a message on social media with 3 photos attached: Beckett's hand on her waist at a party, a hotel key card on a nightstand, and a text message where he'd called Destiny the best part of my week. Harper drove to his office that day, sat in the parking lot for 40 minutes before she could make herself go inside, and when she finally confronted him, he swore destiny was lying, obsessed, trying to extort money from a rich man's girlfriend. He brought her flowers every day for 2 weeks. He proposed a trip to Napa Valley. He told her that no one would ever love her the way he did, and somewhere in the exhaustion of loving someone for 7 years, Harper chose to believe the man over the evidence, because believing the evidence meant believing her whole life had been a lie, and she wasn't ready to carry that yet. By 2019, Beckett Lawson wasn't just a developer's son anymore. He'd built his own firm, Lawson Capital Holdings, worth an estimated $200 million, mostly in commercial real estate and a growing venture portfolio. Forbes ran a small profile calling him Ohio's quietest billionaire in the making. And Harper, who had stood beside him through every late night and every excuse, who had put her own ambitions on a shelf to support his rise, finally got the proposal she'd been waiting 9 years for. He took her back to that same beach in Charleston, got down on one knee in the sand at sunset, and told her that she was the foundation everything else had been built on. She said yes before he even finished the sentence. If you're just tuning in, drop a like and let us know. Have you ever loved someone so much you talked yourself out of the truth in front of you? Because Harper wasn't done forgiving Beckett Lawson yet, and what came next would break something in her that no apology could ever put back together. The engagement should have been the happiest year of her life, and for a while it almost was. Beckett seemed different, calmer, more present, like a man who had finally decided to become the person his fiancé deserved. He introduced her formally to his mother, a sharp, elegant woman named Carol Lawson who had never fully warmed to Harper, viewing her as a nice girl from the wrong side of Dayton who had gotten lucky. Harper endured Carol's cool politeness the way she endured everything else, with patience, because she believed, truly believed, that love was supposed to be earned through endurance. Then, in February of 2023, 4 months before the wedding, Harper's best friend since childhood, a warm, no-nonsense woman named Sadie Monroe, sat her down at her own kitchen table with her hands shaking around a mug of coffee, and told her something that would crack the foundation of everything Harper thought she knew. Sadie had seen Beckett at a hotel bar downtown with a woman who was visibly, unmistakably pregnant, and the way he touched her stomach wasn't the way a stranger touches an acquaintance. Sadie had followed them, just far enough to see them get into the elevator together, laughing, his hand resting low on the small of her back. Harper didn't confront him that night. She sat with it for 3 days, turning it over in her mind like a stone she couldn't put down, before she finally hired a private investigator named Dale Werner, a retired detective who worked out of a small office above a hardware store, using money she'd quietly saved from her own salary over the years, money Beckett didn't even know existed. What Dale found over the following 6 weeks would end the life Harper thought she was building. The woman's name was Kimberly Voss, 29 years old, a marketing consultant Beckett had hired for Lawson Capital Holdings back in the summer of 2022. The affair had started at a company retreat in Aspen, just 4 months before Beckett proposed to Harper on that beach in Charleston. Kimberly was 7 months pregnant by the time Dale's investigation wrapped, and the due date lined up, almost cruelly, with what would have been Harper and Beckett's 1-year wedding anniversary. Dale even found bank records showing Beckett had quietly set up a trust fund in the baby's name, funneling money through a shell account so it wouldn't appear on the joint accounts he shared with Harper, wouldn't appear anywhere Harper might one day look. Harper sat in her car outside Dale's office for over an hour after seeing the file, unable to drive, unable to cry, unable to do anything but stare at the folder in her passenger seat like it might change if she looked at it long enough. 9 years. 9 years of forgiveness, of excuses, of choosing him over her own instincts, and the entire time, he had been building a second life in the shadows of the first one. But here is the detail that made this story different from every other betrayal Harper had survived. She didn't confront him. Not that night, not that week. Instead, Harper Doyle did something that would take a kind of strength most people never find in themselves. She smiled through the cake tastings. She smiled through the final dress fittings. She smiled through Carol Lawson's backhanded compliments about how lucky she was. And underneath every smile, she was making a decision that would take 6 months to fully unfold. A decision that started with a single phone call to a woman named Renata Ford, a corporate attorney Harper had quietly consulted the week after Dale's file landed in her lap. The wedding was set for June 14, 2023, at a vineyard estate outside Columbus that Beckett's family had rented out entirely. 600 guests, a 14-piece orchestra, a dress that had taken 4 fittings to get exactly right. Harper walked down that aisle knowing exactly what was in Beckett's phone, knowing exactly what Kimberly Voss was carrying. And she did it anyway, because Harper needed one final piece of leverage before she could walk away with everything she deserved instead of nothing at all. She had asked Renata Ford to draft something unusual into the prenuptial agreement Beckett's family lawyers had prepared, a clause buried in dense legal language that Beckett's team barely glanced at because they assumed Harper, the accountant's receptionist turned corporate wife, wouldn't understand what she was signing. The clause stated that in the event of infidelity discovered and documented prior to the marriage's legal finalization, Harper would retain the right to a 20% stake in Lawson Capital Holdings' venture portfolio, a portfolio Beckett had built almost entirely with startup investments Harper herself had helped identify over the years. Sitting beside him at his kitchen table, reading pitch decks he was too impatient to read himself. If you're feeling that knot in your stomach right now, that mix of heartbreak and quiet fury, let us know in the comments, because the wedding day itself was about to become the moment everything Beckett Lawson thought he controlled would slip through his fingers. The morning of the wedding, Harper stood in the bridal suite of the vineyard's main house, her mother fastening the last button on her dress, Sadie Monroe fixing her veil with trembling hands because Sadie was the only other person who knew what Harper was about to do. 600 guests filled white folding chairs beneath a canopy of string lights. Beckett stood at the altar in a charcoal suit, smiling the easy, practiced smile of a man who believed his life was about to become even more perfect than it already was. Harper walked down the aisle to a string quartet playing a song Beckett had chosen without asking her, and as she reached the altar, she watched his best man, a longtime friend named Trevor Adkins, glance down at a phone buzzing in his jacket pocket. Trevor's face changed, just slightly, just enough for someone watching as closely as Harper was watching to notice. He silenced it. He didn't know Harper had arranged, through Dale Werner, for Kimberly Voss to be told the exact date and time of the ceremony, not to stop it, but to make sure the message arrived at precisely the right moment. The officiant began the ceremony. Vows were exchanged, Beckett's voice thick with an emotion Harper now understood was performance more than truth. And when the officiant asked if anyone present had a reason the two should not be joined, there was a pause, the traditional pause everyone expects to pass in silence, and in that silence, Trevor Adkins' phone buzzed again, loud enough this time that the front 3 rows heard it, and Trevor, panicking, pulled it out and silenced it a second too late for the words on the screen not to catch Beckett's eye. A name, Kimberly, and beneath it, a single line, "I'm in labor. Where are you?" Beckett's face went white in front of 600 people. Harper watched him look at that phone, watched the color drain out of him, watched 9 years of lies rearrange themselves behind his eyes in real time, and she did not cry. She had cried enough for this man over 9 years to last several lifetimes. Instead, she looked at him, calm and steady, and said, loud enough for the front rows to hear, "Is there something you'd like to tell everyone, Beckett? Or should I?" The vineyard went silent except for the wind moving through the string lights. Carol Lawson stood up from the front row, her hand pressed to her mouth. And Beckett Lawson, billionaire in the making, a man who had built an empire out of confidence and charm, stood frozen at the altar with no excuse left to offer, because for the first time in 9 years, The woman in front of him already knew every single truth he had spent a decade hiding. Harper didn't scream. She didn't throw her bouquet at him, though later Sadie would joke that she wished she had. She simply set the peonies down on the altar table, turned to the stunned crowd and said, "Thank you all for coming. The wedding's off." Then she walked back down the aisle alone, past 600 faces frozen in shock, climbed into the car she'd quietly arranged with Sadie the week before, and drove away from the vineyard without looking back once. If this story has you holding your breath, drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from, because what happened over the following 6 months would turn Harper Doyle from a jilted bride into something Beckett Lawson never saw coming. The tabloids and local business press had a field day. "Billionaire bachelor's wedding collapses at the altar," one headline read. Kimberly Voss gave birth to a son 2 days after the wedding that never happened, and within a week, photos of Beckett standing outside the hospital, disheveled and hounded by reporters, were circulating across every business gossip page in Ohio. Lawson Capital Holdings stock in its publicly traded subsidiary dipped nearly 11% in the following month, rattled investors spooked by the scandal and the sudden instability at the top. Harper, meanwhile, disappeared from public view entirely. She moved into a small apartment with Sadie for a few months, turned off her social media, and spent her days in Renata Ford's law office instead, working through the paperwork that would define the next chapter of her life. The infidelity clause held. Beckett's lawyers fought it for weeks, calling it exploitative, unenforceable, a trap. But Renata had drafted it with surgical precision, and the documented evidence Dale Werner had compiled, time-stamped and notarized months before the wedding, left no room for Beckett's team to argue the affair hadn't predated the ceremony. By August of 2023, Harper Doyle walked away with a 20% stake in Lawson Capital Holdings' venture portfolio, a portfolio worth, by conservative estimate, just over $31 million. But Harper didn't take the money and disappear to some quiet life on a beach, though God knows she'd earned the right to. Instead, she did something that surprised everyone who thought they understood her, including herself. She used part of her settlement to buy a controlling interest in a struggling but promising venture fund called Meridian Growth Partners, a firm two of Lawson Capital's own former analysts had quietly approached her about, disillusioned with the chaos consuming their old company. Within 4 months, using instincts she had spent 9 years sharpening at kitchen tables reading pitch decks Beckett never had the patience for, Harper turned Meridian into a firm generating real buzz in Midwest investment circles. Beckett, meanwhile, was drowning. 2 more women came forward after the wedding story broke, encouraged by the public exposure to share their own experiences with him, and Lawson Capital's board, spooked by the mounting scandal and Beckett's visible unraveling, forced him out as CEO in early 2024, replacing him with an interim executive while the company scrambled to steady its investors. His father's real estate legacy, once his greatest asset, became a liability, as clients quietly withdrew, unwilling to be associated with the headlines. By the spring of 2024, less than a year after the wedding that made him a punchline, Beckett Lawson was unemployed, publicly humiliated, and according to people close to the family, drinking more than anyone around him was comfortable acknowledging out loud. It was Trevor Adkins, of all people, the same best man whose phone had exposed the truth at the altar, who eventually told Harper what had become of Beckett. Guilt-ridden over his accidental role in the wedding's collapse, Trevor had stayed loosely in touch with Beckett out of old loyalty, and in June of 2024, almost exactly a year after the wedding, he reached out to Harper with a strange request. Beckett, desperate and out of options, had applied, anonymously, through a staffing firm, not realizing whose company he was applying to, for a director-level position at Meridian Growth Partners. He needed the salary. He needed, more than anything, somewhere that would still have him. Harper stared at the application for a long time before she made her decision, And this is where our story could have taken the easy path. She could have thrown it in the trash, could have blocked his name from ever crossing her desk again, and no one would have blamed her. But Harper Doyle had spent 9 years being underestimated by Beckett Lawson, and she had learned in the 6 months since her wedding never happened that the sweetest kind of justice isn't always the loudest. She approved the interview. Beckett walked into Meridian Growth Partners' downtown Columbus office in July of 2024 for what he believed was a standard interview with a mid-level HR coordinator, wearing a suit that no longer fit him quite the way it used to, his confidence visibly worn thin by a year of public failure. He was led into a glass conference room, told the managing partner would be in shortly to conclude the interview, and he sat there straightening his tie, rehearsing an explanation for the employment gap on his resume, when the door opened and Harper Doyle walked in, wearing a tailored navy suit, holding his resume in her hand like it was any other candidate's file. Neither of them said anything for a long moment. Beckett's face went through disbelief, humiliation, and something that looked almost like relief, all within a few seconds. Harper sat down across from him, calm in a way that unsettled him more than anger ever could have, set the resume on the table between them, and said quietly, "I read your application, Beckett. You have good instincts. You always did. You just never used them on the right things. If you've made it this far, tell us in the comments. Do you think justice is sweeter when it's loud, or when it's quiet and patient like Harper's?" Because what Harper said next in that glass conference room is the moment this entire story has been building toward. She didn't hire him out of cruelty, and she didn't hire him out of some lingering, complicated love, either, though for one brief second, sitting across from the man she had once planned to spend her whole life with, she felt the ghost of who they used to be pass quietly through the room. She hired him because Beckett Lawson genuinely was talented, and because Harper had learned something in the wreckage of their relationship that she never fully understood before. That power isn't about revenge. It's about no longer needing revenge at all. She offered him a mid-level analyst position, several tiers below where his ego expected to land, with a clear, professional boundary drawn around every interaction they would ever have again. He would report to one of her directors. He would never report to her directly, and he would never, under any circumstances, be allowed to forget who built the firm that was now paying his salary. Beckett took the job. What choice did he have? His name was tarnished across every serious firm in the state. His family's patience had worn thin funding his mistakes, and Kimberly Voss, raising their son largely on her own, still needed the child support payments his depleted accounts could barely cover. He showed up every day for the first few months in a kind of stunned, quiet humility that Harper's colleagues found almost eerie. This once untouchable name in Ohio business circles now taking notes in meetings led by junior directors 20 years younger than the man he used to be. It was in October of 2024, during a late night when most of the office had gone home and only Harper and a skeleton crew remained finishing a quarterly report, that Beckett finally worked up the courage to knock on the open door of her office. He stood in the doorway for a long moment before he spoke, and when he finally did, his voice cracked in a way Harper had only heard once before, at that altar, in front of 600 guests. He told her he understood now, fully and completely, what he had thrown away. He told her that every excuse he'd ever given her over 9 years had been exactly that, an excuse, dressed up as an explanation, because some part of him had never believed he'd actually lose her, no matter what he did, because she had forgiven him so many times before that he'd stopped believing consequences applied to him at all. Harper listened to all of it without interrupting, and when he finished, she didn't offer him forgiveness and she didn't offer him cruelty either. She simply said, "I know, Beckett, I've known for a long time, but I don't need you to understand what you did to me anymore. I needed that 18 months ago, standing at an altar in front of everyone we knew. Now I just need you to file that report by Thursday." And she went back to her spreadsheet, and after a moment, Beckett nodded and walked out of her office, And that was, in many ways, the real ending of their story. Not a dramatic confrontation, not a final tearful reconciliation, but an ordinary Tuesday night where the woman who had once organized her entire identity around loving him simply had better things to do. By early 2025, Meridian Growth Partners had become one of the fastest-growing venture firms in the Midwest, and Harper Doyle was being profiled in the same business publications that had once only mentioned her name as a footnote beside Beckett Lawson's. She bought her mother a house outside Dayton with cash, the same mother who had cleaned office buildings at night to keep a roof over Harper's head. She mentored young women coming up in finance, many of them from backgrounds like her own, women who had been told, implicitly or explicitly, that their worth was tied to what powerful men were willing to give them. And every single day, Beckett Lawson clocked in at 9 in the morning to a job several levels beneath the empire he'd once been building, working for the very foundation he had built with her at his kitchen table and then nearly destroyed with his own hands. She never remarried, not because she'd given up on love, but because for the first time in her adult life, Harper Doyle wasn't in a hurry to hand her future to anyone else's timeline. When people asked her, in interviews or at dinner parties, how she found the strength to walk away and rebuild everything from nothing, she gave the same answer every time, the one that eventually became something of a quiet mantra among the women who followed her story. She would say, "I didn't find strength. I ran out of patience for being lied to, and it turns out that's the same thing." So here's the question we'll leave you with tonight. How many times have you forgiven someone, not because you believed they'd truly changed, but because you were afraid of what your life would look like if you finally let them go? Have you ever stayed in something long after you knew, deep down, exactly what it was? If you have, tell us your story in the comments below. We read every single one, and sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is exactly what Harper did. Walk down the aisle with the truth already in her pocket, and choose, when the moment finally came, to walk back up it alone. Drop another comment and tell us, what would you have done in Harper's position? Would you have confronted him the moment you found out, or would you have waited, the way she did, for the perfect moment to take back everything that was yours? If you've ever loved someone who made you question your own worth, tell us your experience in the comment section below. Thanks for watching, besties. We'll see you in the next story.